So, Christopher Nolan's Tenet. It's possibly the first major release of 2020 in cinemas since the lockdown. I'm certainly not aware of any other major releases since I don't know March in the UK. It's just had its international release as of the time of this recording. I think it came out on the 26th of August. It's now the 31st. And I just went to see it earlier today, and I went into this film with the expectation that many Christopher Nolan fans have when they enter a Christopher Nolan film. Um, I consider myself a Christopher Nolan fan. I've enjoyed, up to this point, all of his films. I haven't seen Memento, admittedly, but I've seen all of them since Memento. And yet, despite me really enjoying what makes a Christopher Nolan film, the really strong, well choreographed action sequences, the sort of often mind bending plot lines and twists. I didn't enjoy any of that in Tenet, even though it was all there in even greater proportions than his landmark, mind blowing Christopher Nolan film, Inception. And Inception is the obvious comparison, which I'll probably end up making a lot throughout this review. But Tenet failed. It failed on a number of levels, and I'm saddened by the way it failed because it seems to have failed at very fundamental levels. Despite it being such a colossal, grand, and from the trailers certainly seemed to be an exciting film, but actually that excitement seems tampered by the reality of what the film is about. So to actually describe the film is simple enough, despite the fact that there seems to be from the trailers this kind of mind bending time reversal stuff going on. That certainly happens in the film. It's explained very early on that the mechanic or the plot mechanic which drives this is entropy reversal. So a physical concept of entropy, which in reality flows forward through time. Entropy only ever increases on a grand cosmological scale. In this film, something is causing entropy to reverse, and this is explained to our protagonist, whose character name, as it turns out, and I didn't pick up on this when I was making my notes whilst watching. I was trying to work out exactly who the character was. I kept just writing him down as John David Washington. Turns out he's actually called the protagonist, which is sort of spoilerish, but I'll discuss that closer to the end. He gets this explained to him very early on in the film, I think in the first 10 minutes. So that mystery isn't really a mystery. We understand that time is flowing backwards in some objects, and that it's possible that these objects are being sent from the future into the past. Okay, so we have this setup. The setup is objects from the future keep appearing. The scientist, the female scientist character, describes it as detritus of humanity, or something like that. She calls it detritus anyway, from the future. So these objects have negative entropy. They appear, from our perspective, to flow backwards. And from hints of conversations we get from her and from this CIA operative who hires John David Washington's character, it appears that there is some cataclysmic world-ending event, World War III, which is non-nuclear and based on time, somehow. That's what we're told. And it appears to be a major problem. So John David Washington's character is told, or sent out and hired to investigate the exact cause of this time reversal that's happening and try to understand why it's happening and then potentially prevent it. So there's clearly an establishment in the universe that this problem has been known about for some time, and that people have been working on solving it, given that they have a whole lab. This is all mixed in a sort of Jason Bourne, James Bondy sort of plot arc. We have CIA operatives. They're called CIA operatives. They're often undercover. They certainly seem to have all of the resources the United States' military available to them covertly. John David Washington is one of these CIA operatives. He's frequently changing costumes and entering new situations and gaining access to places which only a James Bond-like character could ever possibly have access to. He is essentially Deus Ex plot, is what I wrote down. He is someone who does what the plot wills. And this is one of the first problems, is that everything in this film happens according to plot. We're introduced to some side characters. We have Robert Pattinson's character, Neil. Neil is a very, very posh British, as we come to learn, physicist, apparently, who does a lot of the explaining about how this entropy stuff works after we get rid of the initial female scientist. He certainly seems a lot like a Christopher Nolan plot self-insert. He's not the only side character. We also have another side character introduced as this wealthy, affluent white woman whom John David Washington is using to gain access to the people who are creating and dealing in these future time-reversed weapons. This is, for me, where the plot begins to fall down a lot, and where the threads of the film that we expect to come real don't come real, because we're given almost immediately a romantic interest. And romantic interests aren't bad inherently. There's nothing wrong with romantic interests in films. Inception had some romantic interest. But by the end of the 2.5 hours, none of this has progressed. Nothing really has happened. The romantic interest we have, and I forget the female character's name. I would have to Google it to remember her name. I can't remember who she is. She's very tall, but she's just there to occasionally be a problem for the main character. That's all she's there for, is to provide some emotional foil, and a very, very thin, shallow emotional foil to the main character and to the main villain. The main villain, if we could even call him a villain, because he also seems fairly inconsequential, is played by Kenneth Branagh, who, as a very, very stereotypical, over-the-top Russian bad guy. That's kind of what makes this film feel like a Jason Bourne film or a Mission Impossible film. These modern spy, covert, undercover operative style films with very stereotypical non-Western characters as villains. And it seems kind of pointless for us to have this villain in Kenneth Branagh, because we're told that there's a whole Cold War going on with the future, and yet our villain is very much grounded in the present time. In fact, time in this film doesn't really go very far. I think at most we go ahead 2 weeks, and then eventually we come back by flowing backwards in time through this interesting inversion plot mechanic whereby characters can enter a machine and come out the other end simultaneously with themselves going into it. So essentially, if you go into this machine, you will come out the other end, but now traveling backwards through time. So really, the whole plot of this film takes place over the course of a few weeks. But we're apparently meant to be worrying about a grander, all of humanity in the future ending sort of thing, even though we're only talking about the small 2-week time frame for most of the film. So it's hard to give a shit, really, about Kenneth Branagh's character. He is called Sator. It is based on the Sator cube from Pompeii, which is referenced quite a bit. There's a few references to Pompeii. There's other references. The Sator cube had 5 words written on it: Sator, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, and Rotas. So that when you flip the cube around, it appears to always be the same words. So that was the sort of timey kind of interesting thing, is that you've got these characters who appear to have some link to this time, future, backwards thing, and actually it's not that interesting. Kenneth Branagh plays a very simple villain who has very simple motives. He's an arms dealer. He says that the reason he's doing this is because he appears to have been somehow chosen by the people from the future who sent back in time this what's called the algorithm, which apparently will teach past humanity how to reverse the flow of time. So this grandfather paradox sort of thing. And this paradox of the plot is illogical. It's deeply illogical, and it changes frequently depending on what the plot needs. There is this meanderingness to the way it uses this plot device of time being both in reverse and going forward at the same time, and how they can overlap with each other. In fact, there is in the climactic sequence we have a team of people who are traveling backwards in time alongside a team of people who are traveling forwards in time. But we don't see the time stuff more than that. There's a car chase sequence, there's a small fight sequence, and there's the plane crash sequence where this happens. But other than that, there isn't really much this time stuff going on. And again, we can't really care about the stakes of this film if we don't see the consequences of this apparently world-ending potential if they don't stop something from happening. In this case, the algorithm being completed. And I'm struggling for words really to describe the plot in more terms than that, because I just don't care. None of this seems to matter. There are times when we feel like the film is trying to make us care through the characters speaking to each other in a room, trying to explain the plot and why all this matters, but I can't see it mattering at all. None of this plot seems to go beyond these people just doing something with some ambiguous, unknown consequence. In fact, it's one of the few films where at the end of it, I feel like the very end, which kind of seemed to be an aha, this all actually means this, actually made me feel like the previous 2.5 hours were a complete waste of time and inconsequential. There are attempts at multiple points to make us care about the characters. Kenneth Branagh's wife, who he beats, I guess that's Christopher Nolan's attempt at making us care about her, is that she's beaten, even though she's entirely one-dimensional. She mentions her son frequently and how much she loves her son, but it's always in passing, and it only seems to happen just when she needs it. We never see her with her son, because apparently her son was taken away by her husband, but we never see her husband with her son either. So you start to wonder what the point of her son is at all. And then you find out that as they're discussing, in one scene they are discussing the world-ending properties of entropy being reversed completely, they say how this could kill everyone on Earth instantly. And she says, including my son, which was an absolutely laugh-out-loud moment for me. I try not to laugh, actually, but I find it hilarious because it seems so dumb, so utterly moronic for her to, or for the writers to try to make it seem like this woman's son, who we don't know, we haven't really seen, who we don't actually care about, to be the crux of why they need to stop the world from ending. It's her son, and we don't care about him. So that was all pointless, basically. The plot of this film is utterly pointless. We don't care, it doesn't give us reason to care, and none of the characters have any dimension to them. The main character, being called the protagonist, says a lot. I think that all the other characters should have also been named after their role in the film. We should have heard, oh, I'm Kenneth Branagh and I play the villain. I'm unnamed, I can't remember the actress's name, I'm sorry, I'm unnamed actress, I play the romantic foil. I'm Robert Pattinson and I play the exposition and technical explanations. And God, there is a lot of exposition. This is a very talkative film, lots of exposition. In fact, all of the dialogue is delivered as though someone was reading a textbook about how the film worked. It was as if someone, in fact, was reading the plot summary from Wikipedia, and that was the dialogue. It's just flat. There's no, you can't act such exposition-heavy dialogue because all you're doing is saying what stuff is. There's no room in this film for emotions to shine through, and it's a real waste of the actors' potential. And it's a real waste of the audience's attention because we're being forced to listen to what's being said, but then we can't actually connect with what's being said because all it is a description of what's happening. And it's so convoluted anyway that it's hard most of the time to even draw a connection between what's being said and then what goes on to happen in the film. And that's if you can even hear the dialogue. It's become something of a meme in recent years for dialogue in Christopher Nolan films to be masked underneath the sounds. It was most prominent in Interstellar, probably, with Michael Caine on his deathbed and the music roaring to a crescendo, so that we couldn't hear what was apparently a very, very important plot-changing revelation about the theory of gravity and how it will save humanity. It happens quite a few times in this film, where we have this exposition being delivered and apparently important plot plot hints being delivered and we can't hear it. Maybe in some cases it's because there is the roar of a boat and we can only hear sub-bass, overpowering voices, or it's explosions left, right, and center, and we can't make sense of what's going on in a scene. It's so amateurish almost to not understand how to mix audio and to make it so that people can hear what the dialogue is. And sound mixing in general is terrible throughout the whole film, and it's not just when it's masking dialogue. It is bad consistently from beginning to end in all aspects. We have, first of all, the whole film is too loud. I wrote down about 6 times specifically, this is too loud. From the very first scene, bullets are super loud, everything is really loud. It gets to the point where I felt like just walking on the floor was a deafening thing, which is atrocious. There is no dynamic range in this film. We have whispers being as loud as explosions, and bullets as loud as explosions, and dirt rattling off a hill as loud as the loudest explosion. You can't draw any kind of satisfaction from those loud noises when everything is that loud. And especially when loud things, very loud things like gunfire, is so loud that you're cringing and withdrawing into yourself from auditory pain. I go to the cinema and I watch films to enjoy my experience, not to be assaulted in an uncomfortable way where, a primal instinct to me is to just get away from that situation. That's the sound mixing. So there's no dynamic range. The score is forgettable. It often seemed to be trying to emphasize moments. That there was one moment in the film towards the end where the two timelines are happening at the same time, and there's this heist thing. I'm not going to get into logic because it doesn't actually make any sense when you think about it. That's happening, and the score is coming to this crescendo, and it gets louder and louder and louder. And it's happening whilst there's dialogue going on, and you feel like it's meant to be conveying a sense of emotional power, and that what these characters are saying has meaning. But it's the same electronic beeping and beating of electronic drums that we've been hearing throughout the entire film, so it doesn't seem to actually mean anything. There's no association really between what the score is trying to suggest that is happening in the plot and what the plot is actually doing. Action sequences just happen, and the music that accompanies them seems just to be there to be percussive. There are some cool moments. Whilst the score is playing, whilst there's reverse time happening, so we see characters moving backwards from their perspective, the score will play these like reverse string notes, which is interesting, and I feel like that could have been utilized in a much stronger way, in a more melodic way. The score for this film, I know, for instance, wasn't actually done by Hans Zimmer. I forget who it was done by. But I almost feel like if it had been Hans Zimmer or the Bleeding Fingers, Bleeding Fingers, Hans Zimmer's collective of people who help him put together music. If they had done it, then there's a chance that those sort of melodic things, which were done very well in Interstellar and very well in Dunkirk, could have actually been used to greater effect for the time reversal sections. But they weren't, so the score was forgettable and actually distracting when it was playing over dialogue and you couldn't hear anything. Visually, nothing to comment on. Cinematography was just, the camera was there. I thought at the beginning there was some interesting... There were ways the camera was moving in the very beginning, in the very first action scene, which starts the film, where we get very tight close-ups of John David Washington's face. And I thought that would be a very consistent thing. And looking back, it could have been a consistent and interesting way of pointing out when we're looking at John David Washington's character, because there are points in the film actually where he is duplicated and he interacts with himself across the two time directions. It could have been interesting to keep that sort of cinematography going where it was specific to his character and then give Neil, Robert Pattinson's character, his own cinematography. There was some interesting use of color. So reverse time was bathed in a much bluer light usually than forward time, which was a lot warmer. But that was about as interesting as the visuals got. The action sequences and the actual sets and staging of action sequences was all very impressive, but all hard to care about because the plot doesn't make you care about it. If you don't care about why something is happening and the place it's happening in, then it's very hard to care about what is happening. I basically boiled it down to, in order for film to feel effective, and in order for what's happening in a film to feel effective, you need to ground it in a time and a place. This film doesn't have that grounding feature because we don't have a place with the characters. We don't have a real time to connect with because the stakes are so small. So action sequences basically just feel like a checkbox exercise. You know, you've got a plane crashing into a building, which was kind of hilarious actually. And I don't understand how these action sequences sort of seem to happen just because they can happen. The CIA apparently has infinite resources and infinite access to everything in order to make explosions happen and for military people to turn up and start shooting at each other. There's a lot of shooting at Russian goons. For some reason, we don't care about all these innocent people, potentially innocent people, actually dying during these sequences because we don't care about any of the characters. So there's no stakes in the action sequences. So no matter how big Christopher Nolan makes them, no matter how explodey he makes them and how loud he makes them, their actual emotional impact on us is basically negligible, which is a real shame because in other Christopher Nolan films, and we can go back to Inception. Inception has a lot of action. It has a lot of big set pieces, but each of those set pieces feels consistent with the internal logic of the film, which is dream logic. But it also feels inherently, because the plot is based on what the characters are dreaming, to be related to what the characters are. The action sequences in Tenet, on the other hand, are just explosions happening, and they happen on a whim. If a character wants an explosion to happen, it seems that they have the ability to get the resources for an explosion to happen. That also relates to how often the characters jet about from one place to the other. So we get a lot of locations in this film: Switzerland, Estonia. I think a bulk of the film actually happens in Estonia. There's the west coast of Italy. There's Norway. There's India. There's London. There's all these places. Some stuff in Russia as well. All these places, and it feels like more of an excuse for the crew to go on holiday than it does to actually have a reason for these sequences to be happening in the places they are. There's nothing actually that cool about the way these places even look. They just seem distracting half the time. I don't know why things had to be set in Estonia. I don't know why things had to be set in Oslo. It seems like an entirely arbitrary choice for these things to be the way they were. And so we don't have this grounded place for the film to take place in. It just takes place where it takes place, and characters go where they want because they want to. In fact, the editing seems to worsen this effect because during the first act or two acts even, the editing is very, very, very jumpy. There's often times even where a character will be sitting down and it will jump cut to in the same sentence they would have gone from sat down to stood up and now ready to say their next line on cue. Which is jarring. You get this very amateurish continuation of sentences sometimes. 10 minutes later, they're walking towards a train, and then the conversation picks up exactly where it left off when they're already well underway on the journey on this tram in Estonia. All together, annoying, pointless set changes, annoying set pieces which don't make sense, and you don't care, and you don't know why the film is taking you where it is, and you start to get lost. And when the film loses you, like Tenet loses you, you just want to give up. And you try, and I did give up at one point. I think about an hour and a half in, I gave up and just thought, I will let the film do whatever it wants to do next. I kept taking notes to keep track of things. There were a few little interesting things which were interesting just to me. There were some military things, military technology, which I took interest in. There was mention of the 9 nuclear powers, and the 9 nuclear powers interested me because it would suggest that there are more than the number of nuclear powers, or in fact fewer than the number of nuclear powers that there could be. So, we have the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, North Korea, China, Pakistan, India. And I wonder who the other power is, the 9th power could be. Either is it a disarmed South Africa, or is it a nuclear-armed Israel and Iran? I don't know. So there's again some errors there. So I would sort of say overall that this film feels like Christopher Nolan trying to be a lot smarter than he actually is. There were times when I thought actually that he just based the story on things he read on Wikipedia. That there were references to some of the early Russian secret cities, which were these worker cities based around usually the nuclear industry and the chemical industries, which was secret because the people who worked there were working on top secret projects. And that felt like a very internety thing to find interesting. Like you just found an article about it. In fact, I think there was an article about some of these secret cities a few years ago. So I sometimes wondered if Chris Nolan had just read some interesting articles and decided to make a film off of those, which is totally acceptable. If only he'd actually managed to use it in a way which was interesting and made sense. The time travel plot felt kind of a shambles. It felt unnecessary at times. I think this could have been a more interesting film if the stakes had been either actually realistic. So if they discarded with the whole mother and son, I care about him more than literally the entire world dying subplot, and had gone with actually we'll show the world ending. At least then we could compare it to films like 2012 or the Independence Day films where we see all this widespread destruction. Instead, all the destruction is very small scale. It happens on these sets which take place in completely unnecessary locations, or they could be anywhere. There's no reason for them to happen in the locations they do happen in. Or he could have gone the other way and given us a sort of 2012 Day After Tomorrow sort of thing, where you give us a set of characters and emotional connections with these characters, and then we actually care about them surviving. If he'd given us that, then we might not have cared so much about them, being flippant about the entire world ending and only caring about the son, if we actually cared about the son ourselves. And she certainly didn't, so why should we? So yeah, overall, it wasn't even a competent film. It was a very shambolic, poorly put together film. I'm annoyed that it is the way it is. I think it was a great waste of acting because there wasn't really any acting to talk about. It was just people delivering exposition. Kenneth Branagh also played a very, very over the top, stereotypical Russian villain. This basically feels like a Flanderization of Christopher Nolan by Christopher Nolan, and that's always upsetting when someone Flanderizes themselves, because we can see the potential, and I think there were some interesting ideas in this film. The whole time travel thing would have been interesting if it had made sense and if the film had committed to just one thread of the time travel, rather than trying to add in all these extraneous plot details about the end of the world and entropy flowing backwards and destroying everything. If that had been gotten rid of, this would have been an interesting film, potentially, or at least it would have been more interesting than it actually was. So it feels like a shoddy vehicle which drives us from action piece to action piece. Also, Christopher Nolan can jet around the world doing cool things with his acting mates. And that's a real shame. So the first film that I've watched in the cinema since February, for me, I haven't really had the need to go see a film in the cinema since The Lighthouse released in the UK. Was it worth me potentially getting exposed to COVID for? Was it worth the 30-minute walk to the cinema? Was it worth waiting for the trailers to end? I was under the impression, actually, that there was going to be a Dune teaser, and honestly, I think I should have left when I realized there wasn't a Dune teaser. The Dune teaser didn't happen, which was a great disappointment, and honestly, I should have left back. In fact, part of me wishes that I could actually invent an experience and use the time travel inverters used in Tenet, so that I could go backwards in time and unexperience this film. It was a waste of time, basically, and it doesn't even reach the levels of entertainment that shoddy action flicks like Olympus Has Fallen and Independence Day in 2012 reach. It just felt pointless and a complete waste of my time. Having said that, some of the action was exciting. The action was at least well done. The reverse time happening at the same time as forward time, when it was used, and it wasn't used often enough, it was only used really in action sequences. That did feel cool, and it was always cool and satisfying to watch things, and some plot threads overlap with each other. But the little twists and the little turns all felt kind of So, no, I would not watch this film again. I would not recommend it. I'd say save your time and just rewatch Inception. Rewatch Inception.